acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes in the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Our lab also acknowledges that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. Now to introduce our speaker. Noble grew up in Miami, Florida, where he was initially exposed to marine biology through summer camps on Biscayne Bay and recreational fishing. He received his BS in zoology from Duke in 1992 and went to work for University of North Carolina in their marine lab following graduation. After traveling across country with some college friends, he settled in Seattle and applied at UW-SAPS. He originally worked with Frida Taub and shifted to complete his master's with David Armstrong on the ecology of two crayfish species in the Florida Everglades. For his PhD under Dr. Ray Hilborn, he developed quantitative models of the two crayfish species and their responses to water management. After a postdoc with Lou Botsford at UC Davis, he began working for R2 Resource Consultants in Redmond, Washington, forming statistical analysis and developing quantitative models as a consultant. In 2011, he started quantitative ecology and decision analysis, where he has been working since. He's an affiliate faculty at SAPS and has served on several masters and one PhD committee. His other interests are playing music, playing soccer, and coaching the Lincoln High School boys soccer team to a state title last year. So Noble will take questions throughout the talk. Just interrupt him and I'll communicate through that with him. And thanks everybody for coming, and a big thank you to our speaker for sharing your work with us today. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Noble.
All right, thanks, Terrence. And yeah, quick aside, I was lucky enough to get to coach a really good group of high school players. So kudos to them, not so much on my coaching. But if you guys are in the neighborhood and you get a chance to go up, most of the games are either Tuesdays or Fridays afternoons, and it's actually pretty good quality soccer, even though it's at the high school level. So I would definitely encourage you to go up and check it out if you're free one of those afternoons. And the games are at Lower Woodland too. Generally, that's where they play home games. So, all right, moving on from that. So I want to talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on for a little while, looking at some stock identification. So first off, I want to acknowledge the funding source, state water contractors, and then all the collaborators and data sources. And that's kind of been pretty much every agency that collects information on juvenile salmon in the Central Valley. So CDF&W, Department of Water Resources, Bureau of Reclamation, Metropolitan Water District, Fish and Wildlife Service. They've all kind of been involved in this project in some way or another. So anyways, I just want to acknowledge all of the work that's been done there. I'm definitely a desk jockey, so I don't collect really anything from the field. So all of the information that's being analyzed has come from somebody else's work. Okay, quick overview. Let's talk about some mixed stock dynamics, or the motivation here, which is Central Valley Chinook, development of the models, fitting the models to some data initially, and then just talking about a couple different data sources that we were able to use for fitting the models, and then some next steps and so forth. So first off, let's just talk a little bit about a schematic of what is mixed stock management. So this is a nice photo of a leatherback, which is one species that's had some mixed stock management analysis done. So generally, we have distinct stocks that are originating in different locations, but they're coming together in a common location to utilize a resource, whether that resource is good foraging grounds, whether that resource is a staging area. It can kind of vary depending on the problem, but main idea is then they got individuals coming and they're mixing, and we as ecologists want to know something about that mixture. So we take samples from the mixture, and then we also generally take samples from the natal populations too, so we can get a signature, and then do some testing. And oftentimes those tests are genetic tests to try and identify the individuals, but they can be otoliths or they can be other sources of information that can provide some information on, on the natal structure. So once we have this sample of individuals, we then go about trying to assign them back to their source stock based on the test results. And then generally we're interested in drawing inference on the mixture from, the proportion of those fish that we can then assign back to, or animals that we can assign back to their stock structure, and sort of how prevalent each stock is in the mix. So that's kind of the general framework that we're trying to use, and just some examples kind of across some different areas. Or we have application to bluefin tuna, application to gray whale structure in the North Pacific, and then also sea turtle along the East Coast. So and then there's lots of other great examples. Probably one of them pretty close to home is Bristol Bay and the fishery management that occurs there. So the motivation here is on Central Valley Chinook salmon, and we have or there are some different runs, and those runs are designated based on the freshwater entry, including. Can you guys see my mouse moving on the?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we have fall run that generally enter in September, October. We have late fall run, excuse me, a little bit later. We have winter run that generally enter February, March. And then we have spring run that enter in the spring, but then they don't spawn until the fall. And so there's different run timing. Original ideas were that there's probably a continuous run of fish, but that over time they've kind of gotten segregated into these different, rough timing types. They utilize different parts of the habitat in the system. And then the important additional aspect is that certain components of this mixture of Chinook stocks are endangered. So winter run's endangered, spring run has been listed as threatened, and fall run as a candidate species. It's pretty heavily supported by hatcheries, fall run, and a lot of the fisheries that occur on fall run are also supported by hatchery-produced fish. So anyway, so we've got this mix of different runs, and we want to be able to then distinguish among them in some way. And the reason is that they're using these habitats throughout the system, and we're essentially getting mixture distributions. But the stocks are, have differential levels of productivity, and they're susceptible to different levels of anthropogenic mortality. And that can come from either, sort of direct harvest as adults, or sort of as a secondary product of some of the water management that occurs in the system. And so Central Valley is a very productive agricultural region. It's got a long history of hydrologic modification, starting with the search for gold and gold mining. It's got dams on most of the tributaries. There's been modification to Sacramento pretty dramatically in terms of channelization and riprapping the banks. Within the Delta, which is basically the tidal estuary, there's islands that have been created by diking. And then there's just a very large water infrastructure that moves water around, and in particular moves water south into the southern part of the state, where there's not as much rainfall, there's not as much local sources of water. And so a fair amount of the water comes from the Sacramento River and then goes to these export facilities that then export water to the southern part of the state. So in order to do that, there has to be some coordination, and basically fish kind of get in the way of some of this, especially if they're endangered, and that can be a source of mortality. And given that winter run are endangered, then there's basically policies in place to try and minimize the impacts on them. So winter run, story behind them. Originally, their habitat for spawning was up above Shasta Dam. Keswick Dam's a regulating dam that's just below that. So that Keswick Dam now creates the upper bound for which is up here at the top, the upper end of their habitat. But historically, they were able to get into these stream-fed systems that are on Mount Shasta. And that was where, excuse me, they would spawn, and then fish would, basically come down through the system. So currently, spawning below Keswick, there's a small startup population that's basically being initiated on Battle Creek. Since the 70s, there's been quite a drop in the escapement estimates. Those have kind of bounced around with some recovery in the 2000s, and then sort of some low-level populations since about 2015. One thing that's important to note is that the hatchery proportion in the populations has been increasing over the last decade or so, suggesting that the role of hatcheries in sort of maintaining the population is becoming more of a significant component. So that's winter run. And as a result, there's a real interest in trying to identify which fish are being collected and whether they're winter run or not. So one question is, can you use size variation in the juvenile Chinook that are being captured to test and come up with a predictive model for a stock structure? So this is exactly what was developed back in the 90s using a length at date approach. And so on the figure here, what we have are fish that are have been on a floodplain and rearing for different numbers of days. And so the variation in the size at date basically can be indicative. And in our case, what we're interested in is, can the difference in emergence timing that then leads to fish entering the system and then growing be used to essentially differentiate among the different stocks as sort of a rapid way of determining what stock you have in your sample. And generally, the idea is that late fall are larger than winter run, larger than spring run, and are larger than fall run for a given brood year due to the emergence timing of the juveniles. So in 1992, Fisher put together a project basically to evaluate different size fish and to generate these length at date curves. And so it starts in July, and we maintain that approach. You'll see in some of the later figures that I run. But basically what you have are these distinctions based on size, which is along the y-axis here, and date, which is along the x-axis, to distinguish among these different stocks in the system. This length at date curve was then updated in the mid-90s with some additional information. This is a little bit of a noisy graph. The main thing is just to show sort of that there's genetic information that's being used to try and identify which fish are of which origin and where they are sort of in the overall structure. The focus is really to, again, try and get the winter run predictions to be as accurate as possible. And there's, basically a false positive rate that they're trying to reduce so that you don't catch fish that are not winter run and identify them as winter run, and then a false negative also. So you've got other fish that are being, identified, let's say, as a spring run, but truly it's a winter run. And they're trying to minimize both of those errors with these models. So let's say we go out and we are collecting fish, and this is hypothetically, because as I mentioned, I don't actually get to sample for fish very often, and we catch a fish. So we would use our length at date curve, which is also called a race table. And this is what the current race table looks like, which allows us to basically determine for a given date and a given size fish, what category we should assign to that fish. So let's say we catch our first fish and it's 52 millimeters and it falls right in the middle of the fall run category. So feel pretty confident about that one. What about the next fish? Well, it's 89 millimeters and it's just on the other side of the line from fall run and spring run. So in this case, what would happen in the length of day criteria is it would be characterized as a spring run fish. But what we really want to know is, well, what's the probability it's a spring run fish and what's the probability it's a fall run fish given its size? So what we'd like to do hypothetically is turn those lines into essentially areas where we start to get overlap and probability distributions, and then be able to characterize the size of fish and the change in the size of fish over the season, and use these probability distributions of size to then, you know, essentially partition our catch according to these the variation in size. So under that framework, we would have something a little different. So these dotted lines represent the length at date cutoffs. Here's our 89 millimeter fish. And so what we would have is a size distribution for fall run, size distribution for spring run, and a size distribution for winter run. And then using those size distributions, we'd be able to look at sort of the relative probabilities of the fish being in any one of those stocks, and then make a calculation, this again hypothetical, of it being a spring run, which is dominant, but there's still some probability it could be a fall run, and there's, it's 0 for winter run. So anyways, this is the kind of hypothetical idea that we'd like to get to with this length of date. And so how do we get there? Well, we basically need to think about this as a statistical problem and look at this as a mixture model. And basically what we have are finite numbers of mixtures, and we're looking at mixing those size distributions in such a way that we can estimate this latent class assignment, and then we can make predictions for these individuals and, and have probabilities associated with them belonging to each of the stocks. All right, I guess any questions at this point?
Yeah, Mark,
How often do they update the race tables?
did you catch that noble?
Yeah, how often do they update the race tables? They don't. So that's one of the issues, is that it's a static race table. It has been updated so that it would reflect a river versus a delta catch location. But yeah, so that's one of the things too, is I feel like there should be some dynamics potentially that would reflect, year-to-year variability. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so just going to talk now a little about the finite mixture structure. So we're going to have these categorical latent variables, which is our stock assignment. We're then going to have a class model, which is essentially going to allow us to come up with probabilities of class assignment. And we're going to link those to some covariates that we can measure, and then be able to essentially generate a model that's going to make predictions for the covariates that we're measuring, and then look at the probability of assignment to each of the classes, given the observed level of that covariate and these predictions. So the PDF is basically this proportion of the overall, these are our mixture proportions, and then this F of y sub I, comma j. This is basically the predictions for, this is the probability density for our specific component I. So we're going to talk about length frequency. So this would basically be the prediction for our individual that we've just observed, y sub j, given the distribution of sizes for run I, or stock I. So it's basically got two components. One is our growth model that's going to tell us something about what those distributions look like, and then the mixture components. So when we model this, we basically have our individual J. So R is our run designation or stock designation. So that's going to be a categorical random variable with a probability associated for each one of those categories for our individual J. So that's the categorical random variable is just basically a multinomial with a single trial. And then these probabilities are really similar to what we were just looking at. They're basically this mixing proportion and then the probability of observing a fish of, of y sub j, given that the prediction from for that individual j from stock I is x. So x is going to be our prediction from the models. So we titled this plaid for two reasons. One, it's the probabilistic length at date, and then the other is obviously plaid's kind of this mix of different fabric colors. So, it has some double entendre, I guess. The data then we're looking at for a first evaluation is some screw trap information that came from Red Bluff Diversion Dam. We also have screw trap information from Knight's Landing, and then we have some trawl samples that are coming from Sacramento. So we basically have some different sampling methods that are in place to some degree based on the way that the river is being influenced by tides. So it's typically tough to catch fish in rotary screw traps this far down the system because it's still being tidally influenced. And so trawling tends to be a preferred method for capture. What it does mean is that, we'll fit some different models, but kind of operate assume that there's going to be some differences between the sites. These fish are then genotyped using a population assignment using SNPs and the baseline is this Clemento 2014. So here's sort of the numbers that we were able to analyze by location, and then these are the genetic IDs for each race. So you can see that for this Red Bluff, it's dominated by winter run, but yet as you move down through the system, then you see more and more fall run. Is there a question there? Or?
No.
Nope. Okay. All right. So our component distributions are going to be modeled as log normals with a mean and a standard deviation. This is sort of the most generic structure. And then we're going to take and model the means of those log normal distributions using just a linear model. So essentially what we have is a log linear growth model for each site and each stock in its most sort of generic or most flexible form. And so that creates our set of parameters that we're going to estimate for theta with our model. And then we also have the proportions that we're going to estimate. And in this case, we allow the proportions to basically be a 3x3 matrix. So they're varying for each stock at each site. So those are essentially the parameters in our model. And then we looked at some, small variability in the growth models. And I can return to this at the end. Like this is basically one place where there's lots of opportunities for expansion. But essentially our first model is just straight intercepted each way for each stock across all sites. Our second is, a unique intercept for each stock and site. The third actually has a growth component, which is the beta, but the intercept for each stock. This is somewhat equivalent to refitting the original length at date model. It assumes the same growth rate across all stocks and sites. Model 4 expands the growth rate out a little bit to a site specific, and then Model 5 we have intercept is a stock and site, and the growth rate stock and site. Okay, so we fit the model in JAGs. We use sort of uninformative priors for our proportions. This is an informative prior for the intercepts, but it basically just sets the log linear model up in the appropriate space for the growth rates. so that the log length then works within Julian day. That's our time covariate. And then there's a informative prior put on the growth rate, and that goes back to estimates of the growth rate that were used in the length at date criteria, and those were based on some growth studies, so we wanted to try and incorporate that. And then we just have a non-informative on our variance of those log normal distributions. We fit it in JAGs. They're log linear models, so they fit pretty quickly. We don't need to run it for too long. And then we did some, we held out about 10% of the data, and where we stratified by the site and stock, so we could look at a sample prediction. And then we're just looking at basically DIC. Oops, Cole?
Yeah, Cole raised his hand.
Let me go back.
All right. Well, I unmuted you
Well,
or allowed you to talk.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Conceptual question. About how you deal with the relative sizes of the populations, because, if in the extreme, if you had, one population was like 100 times the other side, and you saw a fish that was, in the tails of that distribution for length, but in the middle of a different population, you still would assume that it would come from the first because there's just more fish. So there's like a priori. That is to say that I think the size of the populations matter, but that's also what you're trying to estimate. You're trying to basically put fish into bins to count the size or estimate the size of the population. So isn't there a circularity there? I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Could you?
Yeah. So right now, so what we assume with this, so we've got fish that have been genetically sampled. We've assumed that they've been sampled at random from the catch data, so that the proportions that we're estimating from the genetics, which is just basically, the basically the raw proportions in the genetic data are reflective of that sort of underlying proportion of the stocks, essentially those pi parameters. So if you wanted to, because essentially those are the data that we're kind of working with in order to estimate the model. And I can get to, there's basically ways of estimating those proportions once you have the sort of alpha, betas, and sigmas that tell you what you expect the distributions of each of your stocks to be, essentially by fitting to a catch distribution. And I can look at that kind of at the end of the talk, because you essentially need a second piece of information to be able to estimate those proportions if you don't assume that they're coming proportionally from, sort of your underlying catch. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's helpful. So I guess I was surprised that you didn't use that first step in the prior for the pies.
Yeah, you don't have to, because essentially it comes straight out. What you get are the genetic proportions. So, or sorry, you get for your pies are the proportions in the genetic samples. That makes sense, because yeah, those are sort of that is the mixture that you're analyzing at the moment.
Okay, I think I'm missing a little bit of a piece, but I think that mostly answers it. So let me.
Okay, maybe we can
keep
circle back.
going and I'll think about it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we just look at some simple metrics for model fit. And then there's one metric that we calculate, which is it's this M metric, and it's basically related to an area under the curve of these receiver operating curves. So this is a machine learning metric. And then we use confusion tables, which is essentially just a predicted assignment relative to the true assignment, or the assignment generated from the genetic data. So a little bit more on this M metric. So these AUC ROC metrics are basically used for classifying in machine learning. And the idea is that if you've got a metric at 0.5, it's kind of randomly allocating individuals across for a two-case situation between the two cases. So there was some work that was done to expand it into multiple categories, which is what we want to use since we've got 3 different races we're looking at. And so basically, if you get this M metric that's close to 0.5, it's not particularly great, but as it gets closer to 1, then it's doing a good job of sort of optimizing across true positives and false positives. Okay. So when compare across the models, what we see is basically, if you just look at the DIC values, this model, which was the mean across site and stock, does the best, but its M metric is pretty bad. In fact, it's the worst. So it's doing a fine job of fitting the data, but it's not doing a very good job of predicting or out of sample. And then for the next 3 models, which have growth rates involved, they're pretty similar. The difference is when we look at them in terms of the confusion tables, and these are generated by using the most likely stock assignment as the for the categories. We can generate stock assignments across every draw from the posterior, but this kind of gives us an easy way to compare. And so what we see is that the models are doing a pretty good job of accurately predicting the fall run, and the winter run. And so accurate predictions are on the diagonal, and then inaccurate predictions are in the off diagonals, and then we can see sort of where they're mispredicting. So for model 3, for example, it's mispredicting that spring run are actually fall run. But it's predicting accurately that winter run are winter run. And sometimes it's predicting that winter run. Sorry, it's predicting winter run when they're truly spring run, and it's predicting winter run when they're truly fall run. So looking at these models, and that's kind of consistent. Those mispredictions are kind of consistent across. The one model that tended to, and both of these, model 3 and model 4, basically didn't predict spring run accurately, with the exception then of the last model, which did make a few accurate predictions of spring run, but still it's got a bias where it's predicting spring run or fall run just to a lesser degree. Spring run are a pretty small component of the population, so that was genetically sampled. So this is not so surprising, but we ended up sort of using this last model for 2 reasons. One, it's actually predicting some spring run component, and then also it's sort of, I guess, a worst case scenario for the other 2. And so some of the figures I'm going to show next are based on this last model 5. Okay, I'm going to show 3 panels, and let me just sort of orient you because there's a lot going on in these figures. So this first figure, let's just look at that. So it's winter run. We're interested in which is represented in the blue circles. And then the model fit to winter run is represented as the mean, as the line, and then the dashed lines are the 95% credible intervals on those predictions. And so this is coming off of essentially predicting what the size distribution is for winter run. And then the other points are on the plot just so that you can get a sense of, for the underlying data, how much overlap is there. And then to the degree that this winter run model is essentially capable of encapsulating both the winter run data, and then how much additional or sort of other stock data is also encapsulating, because that'll gives us a little bit of a sense of what some false positives might be for this fit. So likewise, when we go to spring run, fewer samples, and they're fitting. So this black line is fitting to the black circles. And then for fall run, the red line fitting to the red circles again. And one of the things to notice here is that the fall run and spring run are overlapping pretty strongly. Okay, so the Red Bluff fit, then the Knights Landing, which is our second location. Again, winter run. And in general, the models, I would say, are encapsulating most of the data, with the exception of some larger fish. For spring run are unique in this system in that you can have some large fish as early migrants, and those are yearling fish. And so these models generally are not going to be particularly good at capturing that yearling dynamic. And then our fall run fit. And then finally, the Sacramento trawl data. And one of the things you also notice is just that the growth rates being estimated at each of the sites is shifting slightly. And so also part of the reason that model is being favored. Okay, so we basically are able to fit to the genetic data and then look at the probabilistic assignments, which are generally accurate for winter run and fall run. And so then what we can do with the model is basically start to look at assignments, given the model predictions. So here's the model predictions for plaid. And so at Red Bluff, essentially anything in this zone has a almost 100% chance of being winter run, and anything in this zone has a 100% chance of being fall run. And then they're mixed in the middle. And so we've got a dashed line here. So this is for February 10th or so. What would the plaid predictions look like for this day, basically sliced across these different sizes? And so that's what's shown on the right here. And so what we can see is, essentially large size fish have almost 100% chance of being winter run. Those are the fish up here. Intermediate sized fish, there's a small probability that they're spring run. And then an overlap between the fall run and winter run. Yeah, Pete.
Someone to raise their hand.
Yeah.
Okay, you can unmute Pete.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. This is great stuff, Hendrix. The figure on the right here showing the probability of each of the runs is the very, very low probability for spring run. Are these driven in part just by the relative sample sizes of the three runs in this particular example? Is that what's going on?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it basically goes back to sort of the genetic sampling protocol and the low spring run in that, genetic sampling. Okay, so we can look at this, and one of the things to note is that essentially, and so this, there's a line as sort of a mean, and then there's some uncertainty around this estimate, and that's reflecting essentially the model fit to the underlying genetic size data. And so there's not a lot of uncertainty basically in these predicted proportions. So put another way, if you've got a 75 millimeter fish, it's basically saying that the model is saying is that it's pretty certain that it's about 50% of those fish that you're going to catch are 75 millimeters are going to be fall run, and about 50% are going to be winter run. And there's not a lot of uncertainty. So if you resample that a bunch of times, you probably get about a 50-50 split between winter run and fall run. Moving down to Knights Landing, same idea. We start to see that the uncertainty in the estimates are starting to increase, and that's basically and you can see that in the shading around the probability of assignment. And then as we move down to Sacramento trawl, both the proportion of spring run in the samples goes up and the uncertainty goes up. And this is not so surprising because as we're moving downstream, the fish and what they've been exposed to and sort of the variation in their size for a given natal population is going to continue to vary. And so basically, yeah, we're seeing that in the model. Essentially, the predictions are becoming more uncertain as you move downstream. That being said, we're kind of interested in the Sacramento trawl site because it's at the bottom end of the Sacramento River, and fish are then going to enter the delta. And this is important because juvenile fish are susceptible to entrainment in these pumps that I had mentioned previously. They're part of this overall water structure. And so what you have are fish that come down through the Sacramento River, and then they will out-migrate out to San Francisco Bay and then out into the ocean. If there's strong pumping, then some of the flow vectors in the system can get shifted and fish can get entrained down into the South Delta area and in some cases collected in these pumps. And so there's a real interest in understanding when fish are coming down and the probability of basically entraining them. This is not a particularly great place from a predator standpoint, especially later in the like May to June time period. Due to the water temperatures, there's quite a few quite high levels of predation that can occur here. So what we want to do is understand those dynamics. Part of the reason too is that there's a formal process by which take is decided every year as part of a juvenile production estimate. And so the idea is that you have information on the production of winter run coming from Red Bluff Diversion Dam, a series of screw traps there. That's then multiplied through by a series of survival estimates to come up with a delta entry number, and then essentially an incidental take permit is then issued for various activities, including these pumping facilities. So knowing when winter run or potentially coming down through the system would be useful for trying to minimize collecting them in these pumps or diverting them down to the pumps. Okay, so we can use this SAC trawl plaid to basically evaluate probabilities of winter run being in the catch, but we want to be able to account for a couple things. So the first is we've got proportions of winter run in this model that are coming from the genetic assignments, but that proportion may not reflect, other conditions besides those in which the genetic data were collected. So we'd like to vary that so that our winter run proportion can go from being a low proportion of the total population to a high proportion potentially. And then we also want to be able to reflect the risk tolerance of the manager. So if the risk tolerance is low, then that manager wants to, assuming a low tolerance, where they would be interested in any time the probability is 0.25 or greater that you have winter run in that sized catch. Whereas you might have other managers who had a higher tolerance, and then they would be looking at whether that probability is greater than 0.75, for example, of winter run being in that size. So we can run the model then and evaluate kind of what this looks like. And but first I want to talk a little bit about maybe this gets kind of to your question, Cole. So if we have a structure like this where stock A is sort of equally probable, so these are our pies. If they have equal pi across all three stocks, then the prediction here has a 0.84 that it's this middle stock. If it turns out that the first stock has twice the, so P here is 0.66, this is 0.33, 0.33, then we can see that there's going to be an increase in the probability of it being in the first stock just because it's now a larger component of the total mixture. And so even for the same size fish, as you change these stock proportions, obviously that's going to shift the overall assignments. So that's basically what we're doing with the winter run. We're shifting it from 0 to 1. And so then we can create these sort of avoid areas, basically. So for an early season sample, if you found a fish and you're, sort of a risk-averse manager, if you found a fish in this red area, then that would indicate with a high probability or that it's a winter run at this 0.25 level or higher. If instead you have a higher tolerance, then basically this sort of area to avoid shifts over slightly, but not dramatically. What really starts to make a difference is the early season versus late season. And basically by the late season, which is kind of mid-April, winter run are starting to move through the system, and they're essentially not there to be, impacted. So this is one way of sort of evaluating this, and then there are Sacramento trawl data that are being collected, and we can essentially, use these sort of curves to help us understand a little bit about the potential for entraining them down in the system. Okay, any questions on that before we switch over to a slightly different approach? Okay. All right, so the second part of this work is now focused on spring run, which, as I mentioned, they're threatened. This graphic represents in black all of the populations or natal populations prior to modification. Essentially, there's a few main independent populations that are in the upper parts of Sacramento here: Deer, Mill, Butte Creek. And then there's some other dependent populations as well. And then there's some hatchery-supported populations that are on the Feather River and the Yuba River. And similar idea in terms of this overall project goal is to develop a juvenile production estimate down at Sacramento, so that then there's an understanding of how many fish are coming down into the system and when they're coming into the system. And the role of this model, this plaid model, is essentially to try and partition for these rotary screw traps and abundance estimates associated with the rotary screw traps, what proportion are spring run. So this map shows some of the sampling sites. Again, these are sort of the independent populations. These are the hatchery supported populations, and then in the blue are these dependent. So we have genetic data that's being collected at each one of these sites and rotary screw traps, and then being analyzed. The genetic work that's being done uses Sherlock, which is a slightly different approach than the previous analysis. And so for those of you who are not familiar with this, it's kind of in some ways similar to COVID rapid test. And so it basically gives you an indicator of whether the fish that you have is an early versus late fish. And then there's a second assay that can be done that can tell you if it's a spring versus winter fish. And the sampling protocol for the genetics is essentially to pick out size bins and then fill those, numbers of samples per size bin, and then run the assays to then determine what the run designation is. So in this case, we have a lot more control, in a sense, over how the sampling is occurring and how that's being used in the plaid model structure. So this is kind of up and running, or just getting started, or has, within the last year or two. So The models here we modified slightly. So we're using a hierarchical structure on our betas. And basically we're using that dependent and independent versus hatchery supported to, so each of the tributaries within the independent and dependent are being modeled with their growth rates coming from the same distribution. And then the hatchery supported ones will likewise come from a separate distribution. Fitting the models in JAGs, again, kind of similar setup. And so here's some initial fits. We have spring run that are being identified in the population's fall run. And you can see, first off, there's a lot less data that's been collected to date. So the models are quite a bit more uncertain. Same kind of setup. Black is the spring run. This is the spring run model. The polygon shading region is the amount of uncertainty that's due to the parameter estimates. And then the dotted lines like before are the outsides of the log normal distribution on the size. And then because of the way the genetics work, we end up with heterozygotes as part of our overall population structure. And these are basically early, late heterozygotes. So they are expressing some genetic material that suggests they could be either spring or fall. And so we're sort of working through a little bit of that and what that means. And interestingly, the heterozygotes across these sites tend to be intermediate in terms of their size at date between spring and fall, which fits. So deer, the other natal population. I'm going to speed up a bit here because we're going to run out of time. And then Butte Creek, which is spring run only. So with this, these data, basically we can do catch composition and apportionment of our catch among our different stocks, just essentially by using our catch distribution, these genetic samples by the size bin, and then we just essentially reapportion. So that's pretty straightforward in terms of coming up with ways of apportioning the abundance estimate if we've got genetic samples for these sites. And then kind of the interesting part about this study is that there's the opportunity to essentially integrate the plaid sampling with the genetic sampling so that we can optimize for information content. And so essentially there's this sort of iterative process where we run the model, identify where we're doing well predicting race assignment. Where we're not doing well, we can then focus on taking genetics, which will then improve the predictive ability of the model, and then and kind of cycle through that. So that part is interesting and I think pretty attractive for going forward. And so the way we're going to do this is we look at the expected uncertainty for a given size and time. So if this is the schematic off the front, so this is for our February 10th date, we have for this 110 millimeter fish, we have uncertainty predictions off of the winter run. And then we have the uncertainty that's being predicted off of being spring run. Those are our two dominant components. We have the mean probabilities of each one of those. So it's essentially like an expected uncertainty. And then we can calculate that across all of our sizes and dates to create essentially an uncertainty landscape. And then the role of the sampling is basically to go in and sort of target those fish that have the highest uncertainty. And so what this means is if we have groups they're sampling, we can essentially tell them, okay, if you catch a fish on this day that's sort of in this size range, well, that's a really valuable fish for fitting the model. So if you could please make sure you get a sample of that fish, then that'll help us basically improve our model predictions at a faster rate. Okay, some caveats and extensions. Growth models were pretty simple. There's more flexible types of models we could fit, penalized splines, other nonlinear options. There's also actual growth models that are nonlinear. Excuse me. The other piece that I didn't touch on, but that we've been developing as part of this project is that we assumed the genetic testing was accurate without error, which for the most part for winter run it is, but for spring run and fall run, in sort of the first analysis that we did, there is some uncertainty there. And so you essentially incorporate in another step where you're in your categorical assignment, there's error between what your test is telling you and then what the true latent state is. So we've developed that. And then there's just a lot of work around hierarchical structure among these different sites to try and share information in a way that captures the underlying spring run stock structure with these independent independents, and then also deals with the hatchery component. All right, summarize, pretty straightforward and flexible statistical framework for the Central Valley. It looks like it's working relatively well based on some out-of-sample predictions. We've got some more work to do with that in the spring run case. And in some cases, we can use it. It's got high predictive accuracy, and it definitely works better than the length at date in certain circumstances. And so we could reduce probably some genetic sampling if we wanted to have still accurate predictions of stock structure. It's pretty flexible, and it could definitely be applied in other situations. And yeah, and so if anybody, if this piqued anybody's interest or they have a project or some ideas, like I'd love to talk to you. I think, yeah, it's got some general applicability that could be useful. And then the last thing is, the group I've been working with, we're trying to basically get this out so that it's pretty easy for all of the folks that were working on the team at the streams to use. And so the idea being that you'd have date, length, and location information, and then you'd essentially get back some probabilistic statements of assignment. And then, based on that landscape map, you'd also get an indicator to take a genetic sample. So, all right. Thank you very much for lasting through this. This talk wasn't going to be possible without the support of Alan Hicks and the fact that he switched with me. And so he was supposed to give his talk today on Groundhog Day. So happy Groundhog Day to you all.
Thanks, Noble. It's 1:30, so I'll let people who need to leave go. But if you want to stick around for questions, I think we have some time.
Yeah.
And anyone online, raise their hands. Let Noble know.
Yeah, Cole.
Ian's got a question.
I think Cole was ahead. Oh,
Very cool.
Allowed you to talk.
Should be able to hear me now. Yeah, thanks, Noble. Super interesting. I was kind of thinking about that last point you made about that uncertainty landscape and using that to dictate like when you should sample fish. And I guess I'm wondering out loud, thinking out loud, like, does that process, would that like bias any of your growth estimates? I know I'm not really well versed in it, but there's a literature on like, length stratified sampling and all that. And like that can really impact estimates of the growth curves. So I feel like there's an analogy there with you, kind of saying, if you get a fish of this length on this date, get a sample, that's not a random sample. And, does that have implications for your estimates of growth?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And in a way, it's trying to basically structure like an adaptive sampling approach where the adaptive part is kind of like the information, potential information content in the sample. And I think the idea would be, if I go back to that, is that like there's an underlying model, growth model that's already providing sort of information on the other parts of the landscape. So it wouldn't be in isolation of the other growth model. It would be kind of added into that existing. But you got a good point, and I don't know if it would actually, if you'd end up biasing the model results. I mean, so that's something definitely to check out, for me to check out and just run some simulation studies and see if basically if we're running the parameter estimates off of what's known, because we can just simulate this process pretty easily.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Like I don't have an intuition of how it would influence your model, but I think if it's like something you want to do moving forward and has kind of meaningful impacts on stock ID, I would think it would be a good idea to simulation test that to make sure it comes out right.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, Noble, I'm wondering, have you closed the loop yet? Have you got a year of adaptive sampling to put back in and see if you actually achieve a reduction in uncertainty? Because I'm thinking of some of Carl Walter's work, which suggests that, we often learn at the same rate things change. So if interannual variability of growth is the same as the amount of new information you're adding, you might just kind of break even year to year.
Yeah, good question. I haven't put data back in, like from our sampling. We've got 2023, which is kind of our full first year. 2022 was a partial year. That was kind of our spin up. And then 2024, we're collecting data now, and that's coming in. So yeah, we're kind of at this like break-even point on the data collection where I think we can actually start to do that in a real way. Let me see. I did have, I think, some. Yeah, so it's kind of a busy slide, but what I did was to simulate kind of that process. It's not using a different model structure. It's saying, it's basically, here's our landscape. And then what I did was go in and simulate collecting data every 2 weeks. And I think it was like 100 samples, and then fed them back in and re-estimated the model parameters to see how much uncertainty reduced, excuse me. And so this is the landscape after incorporating these data into the model fits. Suggesting, there's kind of two things happening. One is these observations in sort of these dark regions helps to reduce that area enough that it shifts down. And so this is basically winter run, spring run uncertainty in this region. And that shifts down now to spring run, fall run uncertainty after incorporating these data. And then this is kind of a slice through this surface. I think, again, like around day 210, which is early February. And so this is the uncertainty surface in under this initial condition. And then this is the way it shifts to the smaller sizes and reduction overall due to having the additional information in there. But this is, again, assuming that you've got the same model, the same dynamics occurring year to year, not that there's new dynamics occurring in the second year that's shifting things off. So, yeah. Cool.
Allows you to talk cold. Unless that's left over from the previous question. Okay, I'll pass it on to Alan. He raised his hand.
Yeah.
Oh. Sorry, you should be good now, Alan.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Noble. Really cool stuff. Nice to see the salmon world again. Two quick questions. One, I'm just wondering the influence of hatchery fish in this type of analysis, and with the proportion of hatchery fish you showed in one of your earlier plots. Is that complicating this analysis, do you think, in the future? Is this something you just have to keep doing every year? Or is the hatchery in the wild just so much the same that you're not concerned about it? And then another second quick question, do salmon see their shadows, especially on Groundhog Day?
The hatchery question is a really good one. And the big hatchery influence is potentially fall run. When the fall run hatcheries release their fish, then they can tend to just swamp the system. And so, well, sorry to shoot through all this again, but so like this particular situation, go back here. Oops. So what ends up happening is it's like, it's not, you know, a doubling of this first component. It's like 50 times the proportions. So, you know, fall run hatchery releases just totally dominate the system. And essentially, you know, every fish you catch is a fall run kind of, and they have, you know, there's a tail to that size distribution too. So it definitely will mess with sort of the dynamics. And I think the way you have to deal with that is then have those stock proportions, so those pies, be responsive to those sorts of actions. And then, you know, potentially you'd be looking at either try to estimate those or just inflate them, realizing given the information on when hatchery releases are occurring.
Cool, thanks.
Someone's got a question in the room.
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bill Clark. I was curious about your use of log normal rather than normal distributions for the lengths. I mean, if you look at the graphs, they look pretty symmetrical. Is there some principled reason for choosing log normal over normal?
Oh, mostly just to keep everything positive. I don't know that that would be an interesting thing to look at. I mean, for most of these fish, they're, so we look at actually, you know, oops, yeah, the actual data. They are, you know, greater than 30 millimeters. Part of that is due, you know, just to the timing, or sorry, the size of emergence and then the size of capture. So we would probably be fine to use normal distributions. I mean, there is the case, though, I think that the spread in the fish is probably increasing as they get larger. And so that's a nice property of the log normal, is that we're, you know, we kind of get that for free, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, if there is no further questions, thank you again, Noble. That was a super interesting talk. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for putting up with all the technical issues and having to reschedule and all of that. I'm glad we
No, thanks for being flexible.
finally got it. Yeah.
Thank you. Come by more often when you're in town.
Will do.
Bye.
All right, have a good weekend, y'all. Thanks for coming.
Yep.